Welcome to the programme. Well, both sides in the conflict in Syria are being accused of flagrant violations of humanitarian law. And it's put the spotlight once more on the confusing picture that is the conflict in Syria, with both sides accused of war crimes by the UN, a fractured opposition, and Syria widely regarded as the stage for a proxy war. So do you feel you understand what's going on in Syria and indeed have the information to form an opinion at all? We're going to speak to guests in Oxford, in London and in Jerusalem who are watching and reporting the conflict. Plus, as many of you click on the decision in Virginia in the US to overturn a ban on same-sex marriage, we're going to dip into a debate that began in Ireland about whether you're homophobic if you oppose gay marriage. You can, of course, live tweet throughout the programme, or you can head to Facebook or to Google+.
People are going to want to know.
Let's just say something.
Welcome to the programme. Good to have you with us today. If you want to get involved in this, of course, on Twitter, you can use the hashtag WHS throughout the conversation. We're here live for an hour. All of the comments coming to me here on my tablet, and I'll try and weave as many of them into the conversation as I can. Let me introduce you to the guests who are with us for the next 30 minutes or so. Sakar Al-Makhadi is a freelance journalist in London and was in Geneva until 10 days ago, of course, where those talks are ongoing between both sides in the Syrian conflict. Ayman Al-Tamimi is in Oxford. He's a fellow of the Middle East Forum, which is a think tank promoting American interests in the Middle East. And Shira Frenkel is a BuzzFeed Middle East correspondent joining us from Jerusalem. Well, welcome all of you to World Have Your Say. I'm very keen really to sit back and let you guys discuss your views on the difficulties, complexities of really reporting and understanding this kind of conflict. Shira, first of all, as a journalist, how difficult is it for you to actually know what's going on inside Syria?
It's been an extremely difficult conflict to cover from day one. While initially we could get to the rebel-held parts, I mean, the border between Turkey and Syria was incredibly porous, and we could easily cross over, embed with rebel brigades, really get to sort of know the civilian population. That's entirely changed in the last year and a half, to the point where today very, very few journalists are even attempting to cross into Syria. On the other hand, the regime-held parts of the country, which were entirely locked down and inaccessible during the beginning of this conflict, we can now get visas to. And so we've had this sort of limited give and take, this limited access, as it were, that's made it a very difficult conflict to report from an objective sort of point of view, showing both sides.
Sakar, what do you make of that?
Well, the difficulty from my point of view is that mainstream broadcasters, news organisations and newspapers are refusing to send reporters into the country as much as they were before, and simply because of the risk, because Syria is now the most dangerous country in the world to report from. It's the most dangerous country in the world to be a journalist, high probability of being captured, kidnapped or possibly killed. And the impact of that has been to outsource the news gathering to Syrians, to activists, to citizen journalists who have almost no training, certainly no insurance, and what's happened is that the risk has been outsourced. So you have situations like the cameraman in Aleppo who was killed a couple of months ago. It was revealed that he was underage. Reuters was using him as a stringer. Reuters claimed that they didn't realize that he was underage. But what had happened in that case, and in many other cases in Syria clearly, is that the danger has been outsourced from Western journalists and Western reporters going in to local Syrians who are risking their lives with very little training and certainly not the same kind of pay, the danger money that Western journalists would get inside the country. So it's a shifting of the balance of reporting from the outside to the inside.
It's probably fair to say the BBC's Lise Doucette has been in Homs in the last few days. It is always difficult. It's that balance, isn't it, as you say there, between making sure that the stories get out and the safety of organisations, journalists. Ayman, what's your take on this?
No, the points made by the previous speakers is very, very valid. What I would add is that, I mean, I monitor it from a distance and primarily through social media, and in the course of that I've been able to acquire local contacts on the ground, primarily through Skype. But even there's a huge limitation in the how the situation is so fragmented and localized that just because you have a contact on the ground, it's very they have a very limited range of knowledge of what's going on. So, for example, when I was looking into clashes between Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham in Deir ez-Zor province the other day, I was talking to a contact Jabhat al-Nusra representative in the border town of Abu Kamal, and he confirmed to me there were light clashes there, but he had no knowledge of what was going on in any other locality in Deir ez-Zor province. So this fragmentation is a real problem, and even having local contacts, it's no guarantee of giving a much better picture of the situation than if you just rely exclusively on open source social media postings on Facebook and Twitter and so on.
Well, Ayman, maybe you can tell us, and then Sakur and Shira get involved as well, but do you feel then that you do have a clear picture on what's happening? You say it's difficult. Do you feel that there is a clear picture for you?
I think that you can draw a picture while having big caveats on the certainty of what's going on. I mean, despite these limitations of local context, if you rely on both the open access and you rely on your local context, and I think you can draw a broad picture. So I mean, with my view of this Jabhat al-Nusra Islamic State of Iraq and a sham conflict, I mean, it's quite clear that Jabhat al-Nusra in Deir ez-Zor province has the upper hand, and it's reflective of its prior status within the province, and which I was able to cover beforehand, before all this fighting broke out. And the overall picture throughout the entire country of Islamic State of Iraq and Sham versus other rebel groups is very much a consolidation of existing positions. And so I think I think that it's possible to build some kind of broad picture while acknowledging the big limitations on what you know.
I think what Ayman's saying about the fragmentation is very important, because there isn't a single front line in Syria. It's not a Libya situation where you have the rebels in Benghazi and the regime in Tripoli, and the front line is shifting, and we're following this progress along the coast as the rebels move. It's not like that in Syria. There is city by city battles, there are neighborhood by neighborhood battles. And so the problem that we have is that we're following stories from across the country. Some are contradictory. You have the rebels winning in Aleppo and losing in Homs. And so what happens is that in weeks like this, when we focus on the evacuation and the aid mission into Homs, we're ignoring the rest of the country. And what you see is that a lot of journalists are kind of pulling back and looking at the big picture and focusing on what's happening as a whole rather than what's happening in individual cities. And it's very difficult to keep track of who's got the upper hand and where this battle is going.
I just want to add here that part of the reason journalists are pulling back is because that's what readers are interested in hearing about at this point. I think at the beginning of reporting on this, readers were more interested in the day-to-day ins and outs of what was happening in Aleppo, what was happening in Homs. But as this has gone forward, there's been quite a bit of reader fatigue. And we found that by pulling back and giving a bigger sense, a sort of wider lens on what's happening in Syria, readers have gotten more involved on that point. On the point made earlier about social media accounts, there's no doubt that the YouTube groups and Facebook and whatnot have been incredibly useful in monitoring what's happening in Syria. But I find for myself, as a reporter, the danger is that you can't really rely on what you're seeing online. I have a contact on Skype that I've been speaking to for years, and only recently found out that that Skype group, in fact, had been taken over by another person, and that the information that had been at one point very reliable, very accurate, had suddenly become distorted and was becoming increasingly radicalized. And I know from speaking to colleagues that that's been a growing concern, a growing problem. A lot of the groups that initially tried to be a bit more balanced online and how they portrayed events and how they portrayed what was happening in their own cities have now felt pressure to become increasingly radicalized about how they portray themselves.
Well, as we have this conversation, obviously people are watching all around the world and getting in touch with us on Facebook at facebook.com/world have your say, or on Twitter using the hashtag WHYS. Furman is a Syrian refugee in Bulgaria and has posted on our Facebook page. There are too many pictures and in fact too much information, but that does not mean we can't form an opinion on the conflict as Syrians. And maybe it's easier for Syrians to understand, but you talked there, Shira, about the problems people have with fatigue. How do you tackle that? This is a conflict that's been going on for 3 years. How do you engage people on what's a very serious issue, but they're overwhelmed with information, as we heard there from Furman?
I always find that reaching out and sort of, it's cheesy to say at times, but having a personal story. I mean, I don't think anyone will forget the video that came out last week of a young baby being dug out of the rubble. That's something that it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you will be touched by that. And I think, I hope at least, that readers will go past the video and find out a little bit more about the scenario that led to that baby being under the rubble. I think that once you start to bring the story home to people, you talk a bit more about the refugee crisis and how this is going to be potentially a decades-long refugee crisis, people start to care and start to sort of relate the story back to themselves.
In a moment, I want to introduce you to Rami Khouri, who joins us from New Jersey. But Saka, first of all, what do you think, as a journalist, you can do to tackle that sort of reader fatigue, as Shira called it?
Well, you know, she has a very, very valid point, and that is to humanise the story. But it really is getting so difficult to find new angles on the Syria story. So, you know, when we're out in the field, you know, meeting very interesting characters, finding new ways of telling this story. So I was in the Zatari refugee camp on the Syria-Jordan border a couple of months ago, and refugees there a year previous were desperately trying to get out. They would do anything to leave the refugee camp and set up home outside in cities, make their way for themselves, because the situation was just so dire. But now they're returning into the camp because they're building their own city, and in some ways it's a Syrian city in exile. So it's kind of stories like that. The refugee story is going to become even more prominent as the war goes on, and as the Syrian population, as Syria in fact displaces itself outside its own borders.
Let's bring in Rami Khouri, who is a columnist for the Lebanon Daily Star, joins us from New Jersey. Welcome to World Have Your Say. Rami, you've been listening to our conversation. What do you want to add about the challenges you face in reporting the situation in Syria?
Well, there's really two stories that are taking place simultaneously that need to be covered. The first one is the one that your contributors have been talking about, which is the difficulty of getting on the ground factual and balanced reporting because of the dangerous situation there. The second story is the bigger diplomatic one, which is taking place in Geneva and Russia and Washington, Tehran and Riyadh, and all over the region and all over the world. And these are the two stories that really need to be seen together. What happens on the battlefield influences the position of the diplomatic players, and vice versa. This war is not going to end in Syria by one party defeating the other in the short run, I don't think. It's going to end one day when the external players, especially the Americans, Russians, Iranians, and Saudis, when they decide that the war is hurting them more than it's helping them. So covering those two stories simultaneously is the real challenge of what's going on in Syria. The humanitarian side and the sheer epic human nature of the story, the barbarism, the killing, the suffering, the exile, the huge numbers, millions of refugees, is a whole new dimension to war reporting and its implications on the neighbors in the region.
Shira, I can see you nodding.
I agree with a lot of what's said. I mean, I, of course, in the region here, cover less of the diplomatic side. That is its own story. Here on the ground, you know, we focus a lot more on the day-to-day events, the trends that we can witness, and we hope that that helps fuel some of the discussions that are happening in Geneva or New York. And so, yes, I agree with a lot of what was just said.
Well, do stay with us here on World Have Your Say. As I look down on my tablet, so many comments coming in from the UK, Afghanistan, New York. I'll read a few of those to you in the next few minutes, but do stay with us.
No, I am talking about it. Let me say something.
Welcome back to World Have You Say. Lots of comments coming in. Marshall in Afghanistan on Facebook says, the US is playing a game with human lives and so is the United Nations. Why does no one want to stop this war in Syria? And Stanislav in New York says, this is an Arab matter. Let us keep out of it, especially while President Obama is in power. Syria will turn out to be another Libya for this commander-in-chief. Keep sending us your comments and we'll weave them into the conversation. Still with us here on World Have Your Say, Shaka El-Mahadi, who is a freelance journalist in London. Ayman Al-Tamimi is in Oxford. He's a fellow at the Middle East Forum. And Shira Frenkel is a BuzzFeed Middle East correspondent joining us from Jerusalem. I want to pull up one comment now. Scott Taylor wrote an opinion piece in Canada's Chronicle Herald. He said, it is amazing to see the difference that 1 year has made in the way the Syrian conflict is being portrayed in the Western media. Last Christmas, the cries from those advocating an international intervention was reaching a crescendo. Do you think that's a fair point, Shira?
I'm sorry, I actually missed a bit of what you had said, but I think you were referring to an opinion piece I read about how at one point there seems to be quite a bit of advocacy for intervention, and now that call has faded.
That's absolutely right.
Right. Certainly, and I think that's a variety of factors at play. I do think that fatigue with that conflict and in general with the wider region has led to the dimming of a lot of those calls. I also think as coverage changed and as the regimes that slightly opened up and allowed journalists into Damascus, people's view of what was happening in Syria changed. And the third point I'll make is that the makeup of the Syrian, once we call them the Syrian rebels, the Free Syrian Army, those fighting against the Assad regime, the makeup of those groups has changed. And I know that among a lot of the Western officials who study what's happening in Syria and make recommendations back to their governments, there's been a great deal of concern over what intervention would actually mean and on whose behalf they would actually be intervening.
And as you say, at the beginning of the conflict, it was very much portrayed in the Western media that President Assad was bad, the rebels were good. And as you say now, the rebels have fragmented, there's more foreign fighters. It's more a confused picture. Once again, we get back to the issue of it being confused. Do you agree, Sakar?
Yeah, and I think that, she's absolutely right in that the regime narrative has pushed this line that all anti-Assad rebels are jihadists, and that chimes well with the West, which is trying to fight terrorism, and so they're trying to discourage any intervention because it's Assad or the jihadist rebels who will replace him. So there has that been that fear-mongering, and also, of course, it's the chemical weapons debacle when Obama and David Cameron failed to intervene and have kind of pushed that off the table. So I think that's a bigger reason why we're not discussing intervention anymore. And so the effect of that has been to turn Syria into a magnet for jihadists, Western jihadists, who are heading into the country and thinking, well, if the West isn't going to act, we're going to do it ourselves. And they're heading into the country, as we saw with the British suicide bomber who drove a truck bomb into a prison in Aleppo. Heading into the country, it has emerged on aid convoys. And that's having a terrible impact on the aid situation. Now we've got security forces in the UK calling for unofficial aid convoys to be banned from entering Syria. So anyone who wants to enter Syria may face suspicion even if they're heading on an aid convoy. So, you've got these three things working in and feeding into each other. And the reason is, for many reasons, that Syrians and Western supporters of Syria are saying, well, the West has forgotten us. So if the West has forgotten us, we're going to have to act either as jihadi rebels or as aid workers heading into the country. And so it's all kind of fed in from this hands-off approach that the West seems to have taken militarily.
Eamon, you're nodding.
Yes, I mean, definitely. I think if there's one thing, actually, I would say that did really dampen any calls for intervention. I mean, it was the rise of the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. I mean, the way it advertises itself on social media, in particular, looks very intimidating. Their territorial control isn't insignificant, actually. So, I mean, since the infighting broke out, they basically seized the entire province of Raqqa. Again, something I corroborated through social media for talking to local contacts. They control the entire province except for a couple of regime air bases and a Kurdish enclave just west of the northern border town of Tel Abyad. Yes, I mean, I think before though it was liable to overstate their presence, but that was because they advertised themselves so well on social media, and then I think in particular that gave the impetus for people to pose the dichotomy of, well, if we try to depose Assad, then Al Qaeda takes over. This narrative. So I think that's the number one thing that has really driven concerns about getting involved.
Eamon, you mentioned social media there. It's been raised a couple of times in this discussion that we're having. What has the role of social media done to the way it's been played out and how people are understanding this conflict? Because it has really changed over the course of this war, hasn't it, Shira?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think that what I've found most interesting is the way that non-journalists and people who generally aren't interested in Syria have taken to social media and tried to form their own decisions about what's happening in Syria. As a journalist, it's always interesting to watch. The other day, I wrote a story about Syria, and a lot of the people who tweeted at me or left comments on the story had watched their own videos and sought their own information and had questions for me based on what they'd seen online. As I said before, though, part of the issue here is finding verified sources of information online. I think there's been some bloggers who have been fantastic at that. The Brown Moses blog has been reported on this show as well as others and has been a great source of information. But a lot of the struggles they have, as well as us, as I said, was trying to find the sources of video and images and whatnot that we could actually rely upon.
Well, let's bring in Peter van Oosteen, who is a historian and Arabist in Mechelen in Belgium, joining us on the line now on Skype. Peter, welcome to World Have Your Say. I know you looked very much at the role of social media within this conflict. What are your thoughts?
Good afternoon. Well, as I've been hearing on the discussion between Ayman and Shira, indeed social media is of increasing importance in this conflict. It's been for me, for example, it's my main source to find all the material on, for example, foreign fighters in Syria, and especially also for the main jihadi groups.
And how has it changed over the course of the conflict from the original things that we saw put up on YouTube to now how people use it and the battle that's being fought between both sides on social media?
It's quite confronting to see that since the infighting started early last month, that the tenure of the social media posts used by groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham, they turned on each other rather than in for example, last summer when they had increased it in, how should I say, they were increasing their approach towards the population, filming dawah meetings and stuff like that. Now the things we see most is, well, actually sometimes even propagated material that is clearly, after a while, you can find out that it's not properly used or falsificated, and these things are emerging more and more right now.
Peter, forgive me for jumping in. Your Skype line is slightly glitching with us there. I wonder if you want to pick up on this falsification, this verifying of social media, which is so important, as we heard earlier from Sakar. If media organisations around the world are relying on citizen journalists, it's so important to authenticate what we're seeing on social media.
Yes, definitely. And I think that one can be liable to extrapolate too much from, say, photos are put out on social media. So again, to this example of the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham, well, before all this infighting broke out, they'd often put out photos, say, of an Islamic court or a base they had in a particular locality. And then I think you could be liable to think that, well, that must mean they control that locality. But in reality, I mean, before the infighting broke out between the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham and the other rebel groups, in the majority of localities, it was just that they were one faction of many. So this is actually why, when the infighting broke out, the initial losses of the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham were quite rapid in the face of a multi-pronged attack. So, you know, rather than having lots of strongholds, say one faction among many in a large number of localities, and that meant they could be easily driven out. But since then, they changed their strategy and is to focus on one stronghold at a time, and that's helped them consolidate positions where they were particularly strong. So again, like Raqqa province, northern Aleppo province, and eastern Aleppo province.
Thank you so much for joining us, Shira, and also Sakar here on World Have Your Say. Alex in Kenya says the so-called international community has failed the Syrian people. The claims that Al-Qaeda is fighting alongside the rebels is an excuse, but the regime of Assad will fall one day. Stay with us, we'll carry on talking in the next few minutes.
Let me say something.
Hello, I'm Chloe Tilley. We're live discussing gay marriage. Many of you have been clicking on and sharing a decision from the state of Virginia which overturns a ban on same-sex marriage, and it taps into a debate that's being held in Ireland about whether you're homophobic if you oppose gay marriage. So if you disagree with the idea, is that the same as discrimination? Stay with us here on World Have Your Say.
I experienced.
This is chaos. People are going to want to know. Let me say something.
Welcome back to the programme. Let me introduce you to the guests who are joining us now. Rory O'Neill, aka Panti Bliss, is an activist and drag performer in Dublin. We will see a video of him speaking in a couple of moments. Brandon Ambrosino is a writer in Baltimore, and we're also joined by Caroline Farrow, who is a member of Catholic Voices from our Brighton studio. But first of all, we're going to play you part of a video put up online speaking as Panti Bliss. Rory put that video up about homophobia in Ireland. It's had more than 500,000 views on YouTube and it started a debate. Let's have a listen.
And for the last 3 weeks, I have been lectured to by heterosexual people about what homophobia is and about who is allowed to identify it. Straight people have lined up, ministers, senators, barristers, journalists have lined up to tell me what homophobia is and to tell me what I am allowed to feel oppressed by. People who have never experienced homophobia in their lives, people who have never checked themselves at a pedestrian crossing, have told me that unless I am being thrown into prison or herded onto a cattle truck, then it is not homophobia, and that feels oppressive. And so now, Irish gay people, we find ourselves in this ludicrous situation where we are not only not allowed to say publicly what we feel oppressed by, we're not even allowed to think it, because the very definition, our definition, has been disallowed by our betters. And for the last 3 weeks, I've been denounced from the floor of the Oireachtas to newspaper columns to the seething morass of internet commentary, denounced for using hate speech because I dare to use the word homophobia. And a jumped-up queer like me should know that the word homophobia is no longer available to gay people, which is a spectacular and neat Orwellian trick, because now it turns out that gay people are not the victims of homophobia, homophobes are the victims of homophobia.
And that was Panti Bliss. As I say, that video going up online, over 500,000 views on that. Rory, I'll bring you in. It was interesting watching Brandon's face during that. He was smiling during some of it. But Rory, I've watched that whole 10-minute video, which is up on YouTube, and you did sound quite emotional at times. Your voice was shaking. Did you find it a difficult thing to talk about on that stage in front of all of those people?
Well, I think it's always difficult to try and express your personal emotions in a public context. But I think as a gay person living an everyday life here in Ireland, and I think it's in common with gay people around the world, we constantly have to deal with these small psychic cuts, this sort of low level of homophobia. And we're somehow expected to just accept that, this low level of homophobia. And people sort of point at us and say, well, what are you complaining about? You know, you're not living in Russia, as if that makes it okay. And I just don't think it's okay.
Let's bring in Brandon, who's a writer in Baltimore, and you've written a piece for The Atlantic that's saying that being against gay marriage is not homophobic. For people who haven't seen that article, just outline your thoughts, if you would.
Sure. I think right now the word homophobia is being used, and quite rightly it is used of some people, but it's being used too broadly, I think, and it demonizes or it vilifies everybody who has any sort of reservation about gay marriage. And I would just like to open up the conversation. I think when we throw out a label like homophobia, we sort of stop the discussion before we can even have it. And I would want to open up the discussion.
Well, let me introduce you to Caroline Farrow, who's also with us. And Caroline, after you've answered this, I'm keen for the three of you to have a conversation, and I'll very much sit back. But Caroline, what are your thoughts on this? The idea that if you are against gay marriage, you are in fact homophobic?
I would agree with what Brendan, I think, was just saying, that no, if you're against gay marriage, it's because you, the way you view marriage, you view marriage as very much a child-centric organisation. And having a view on what marriage is and what consists of marriage does not in any way encompass any hatred or dislike or extreme aversion to gay people, far from it. And I think to try and reframe it as being an unkind or spiteful motivation is really unhelpful. It seeks to shut down the debate.
Well, I would agree with Caroline there if being against gay marriage were somehow of no consequence to gay people. But, you know, campaigning against gay marriage and not allowing gay people to get married does have real consequences in the real world. It stops gay people, you know, having full access to the legal protections of their families. it affects the children being raised by gay couples, and gay couples, of course, are raising children whether or not people like Caroline want them to. That is a fact of life. And being against gay marriage is actually affecting those children every day in a real and actual way.
But I think the point that we're trying to make here, Rory, is, and I would agree with you, and actually, believe it or not, the Catholic Church would agree with you here, nobody should suffer unjust discrimination or any unjust discrimination on account of their sexuality. The Vatican and the Catechism, the Catholic teaching is really, really clear on that. And so where, obviously the situation in the UK has been a little bit different, where you are not receiving equal rights, whether that be inheritance rights, employment rights, whatever those rights may be, of course you should have them, and of course you are entitled to them. But this is about marriage being a child-centric institution, and therefore where I think you'll be better placed, instead of saying, well, we want marriage, just what are the rights you want and why. And if marriage is just about love, if marriage is purely about feeling for each other and adults, then why do you need the state to mandate your relationship? Romantic relationships should be nobody's business.
Well, I think of the day when most people get married, they don't sort of say, I do, and only think about having children. Marriage is a much broader institution than that takes into account the feelings of people on a much deeper level than simply a desire to have children. But even if you want to reduce marriage to simply being about children, and I certainly would not do that, but even if I were to do that just for the sake of argument, you are still, by not allowing gay couples to get married, you are hurting actual children now.
How would you say that children are being hurt? Because surely what is best for children is that they have, where is at all possible, that they have a loving mother and a loving father. Where there is a child, there is a mother and a father somewhere. Nobody is saying that gay people are incapable of being good parents, and anyone that does should actually be shut down or rebuked for that. No one's saying that gay people, sexuality makes you a bad parent, but what we are saying is that where possible, children should be raised by their biological parents, by their mother and their father, and therefore when you start saying marriage is just about two people in love, and therefore so long as children have anybody that, two people who love them, that actually deprives children of a fundamental right, and that's to their biological mother and their biological father.
Well,
so
first of all, I would say that is yes, Brandon, sorry.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we're seeing to get it back on track is, if we were to say, well, Caroline is homophobic, we would shut down the conversation. But now by actually having a conversation with her, we're hearing her concerns and we're able to actually engage in a meaningful way. So I can take on the claim about, marriage being a child-centric institution. And then we've gone from this very base discussion of my feelings are hurt to getting to the real heart of the issue, which is, what is the purpose of marriage? Is there a purpose to marriage? Then we're into philosophy and we're talking about the word nature. Then we're talking about utility and design. So as we're seeing just in these brief moments, this is so much bigger than the word homophobia. And I would love if our conversations went the way that they're going right now, rather than you're homophobia, you're homophobic, you're wrong, stop talking. This is a great discussion.
And
I just think it's incredible that the word homophobia has become so loaded, and even people who take homophobic positions are absolutely terrified to be called homophobic. Well, but the truth is that we live in a homophobic culture, and all of us are affected by that sort of, deeply ingrained prejudice against gay people. It's just normal and standard because we've grown up in that society. And I think it's wonderful that people take offense to be called homophobic, because they should. But I would hope that instead of, freaking out about it, that they would just examine their own internal dialogue and ask themselves, why are they taking this position against gay equality? I would suggest that really what it boils down to is homophobia within you. I think that's honestly the way it is. And I think it's a perfectly fair word. The very man who invented the word was a heterosexual man, and he, to this day, is vociferously arguing for it to be, kept in use and to allow gay people to call homophobia when they see it. The word was designed and coined to allow gay people to say, the problem isn't with us, the problem is with you.
But right. I'm not saying that we should throw out the word. I'm not saying let's throw out the word altogether, but I'm saying, do we have to be so quick to use it? I think that there certainly are people. In my country, we have the Westboro Baptist Church. those people are hateful and bigoted and discriminatory. And if we want to use the word anti-gay or homophobic, we can apply it there. And I wouldn't have a problem with applying it there. But to use the same word of the Westboro Baptist Church and to take and to apply that to Caroline, or to apply that to my parents, or to apply that to Pope Francis himself seems a little bit absurd to me.
Well, Brandon, for a writer, you seem to have a very reductive idea of what words are. Words have degrees to them. And, you know, is somebody who lynches a black person racist? Yes. But is somebody who also chooses to serve a white woman at the counter of their deli before a black woman racist? Yes, that is also a racist person. Obviously, it's a different degree of racism, and I would say that the same applies to homophobia. You can be extremely homophobic and violently homophobic, or you can be casually homophobic. And I think people who are against gay marriage simply because of the sexuality of the people involved are homophobic.
No,
it doesn't mean you're the worst person in the world.
No, I don't think that's true, Rory.
You could be a beautiful person in many other ways, but you do have a discomfort with gay people.
But Rory, can you listen for a moment? Basically, in the UK last year, we had a survey, as I'm sure you know, of gay people who were in favour or who were against gay marriage. Now, interestingly enough, only 50% of the LGBT community who were surveyed were in favour, 25% were against, and the other 25% weren't really sure. So there was not a strong consensus, and I don't think it's fair to accuse either the gay people who were against gay marriage, because they said, well, why should we conform to heterosexual norms, of being in some way hating themselves, and also, you know, from my perspective,
that's absolutely fine. I'm not.
You know,
I don't believe that anybody needs to get gay married, and there are plenty of gay people who don't agree with marriage as an institution.
But they
in
are
itself,
not.
And
they're not homophobic.
That's perfectly valid.
But they're not homophobic.
But their argument isn't against gay marriage. Their argument is against marriage, and there are straight people who will make that same marriage argument as well. You can be against marriage and not be homophobic. That's fine. Go for it. But I'm just saying that there are plenty of gay people who do want to get married, and they should be allowed because they are equal citizens. You know, a gay British citizen or American citizen or Irish citizen is equal in every way by virtue of citizenship as a heterosexual one, and should be treated exactly the same. They pay the same taxes, they buy yogurt in the same shops, they take the same tube trains. They are citizens and should be treated the same.
No, and of course that's right. But the thing is, with marriage, anyway. Well, I mean, to come back to your original point, if we go back to what sparked this whole row off, for example, you know, I know Breda and I know Dave, and I know that they are the most loving and generous and kind people. And when you say
there are also some terrible ones. Don't worry.
But when you say to somebody you are homophobic, actually what you're saying is your motivation.
Caroline, I'm just going to jump in here because for people watching all around the world, they're not going to be clear on this. What originally started this was a conversation on RTE television between Rory and some other commentators, and various accusations were made to one another. And in the end, it turned out that RTE made a payout. So we're going to steer well clear of that because we don't want to get involved in any legal problems. But just as a bit of context, I wanted people around the world to be aware of that.
What I wanted to say was that in common with those people, you know, I'm opposed to gay marriage, but I hate to use the old canard, I have gay friends, but genuinely we do. We have gay friends and we have gay couples as friends. You know, we invited and we're really delighted to welcome gay couples to our wedding. Now, that is not the action of somebody who hates gay people or who wishes to exclude them their rights. What we're saying is that marriage always has conditions attached to it. You know, you have age conditions. You can't marry close blood relatives. You must be of sound mind. And the other condition is you must be a male and female. So marriage always has a set of conditions attached to it, and what we're not saying you should be denied your legal rights, your basic legal rights, because of your sexuality. Of course not. But what we are saying is that marriage is a child-centric institution, and that is the reason why a man and a woman should always enter it. It's nothing to do with hatred or dislike or contempt. Far from it. And it's so hurtful. I know you might say, well, get over it, but it's so hurtful because you're saying to us, in effect, you're a hypocrite because you hate us and you dislike us and you want to do us harm. And
I'm
actually,
not saying you hate me. I'm saying you're uncomfortable about what you think I do. What this is really about is a reduction of gay people from being people who are to being people who do. You see gay people as people who do gayness rather than people who happen to be and are gay. And because if you accept that people just are gay, that is is part of who we are, then you should have no objection to us being who we are and expressing that through marriage like everybody else.
But then again, it's to do with identity, isn't it? You know,
yes.
we say that, certainly from a Christian perspective, we say that there is so much more to our identity than our sexual preferences. You know, there's so much more to me, I would hope, than somebody
Caroline,
who chooses...
You're totally welcome to that view as a Christian. I'm not asking to get Christian married. You know, I think you're perfectly entitled to that view. I may not like it, but you know, it's your view, and I'm happy for you to have it if you want
Rory,
to. But I'm not looking for Christian blessing. I'm looking for you know, a civil marriage to be just treated the same way under the civil law as everybody else.
Rory, Brandon, I know you're desperate to get in. We've got to take a quick break, Brandon, so we will come straight back to Brandon to carry on with this fascinating conversation in a few minutes' time.
No, I'm talking about it. Let me say something.
Welcome back to World Have Your Say. We're discussing whether it's homophobic to be against gay marriage. Lots of you getting in touch with us from around the world. So Tetsi in South Africa via WhatsApp says gay rights are human rights. Religious people must stop paraphrasing the world's oldest book because their interpretation is the root of negative stereotypes. Meanwhile, Mohammed in Frankfurt on Facebook says this is not about human rights. This is about keeping things in order. Tolerating such acts will eventually deteriorate any nation. We're still joined by Rory O'Neill, Brandon Ambrosini and Caroline Farrow. And Brandon, you were trying to get involved before we went to the break, so by all means make your point.
Yeah, so Rory sees a difference between what people do and what people are, or he alluded to that. I think that's really important. One of my models for life and in writing is Martin Luther King, and one of his principles of nonviolent resistance is we need to differentiate between evil and the evildoer. So we have to find a way to condemn evil without condemning the evildoer. And when we use the word homophobia, what we're doing is we're condemning both. We're going, not only is it wrong logically to argue against gay marriage, but it's also a moral flaw. And I think that we have to be able to separate the two. Somebody can be intellectually wrong and still have good intentions about that.
I don't disagree with that at all.
I also think that there's too much emphasis upon what people do. Actually, most of us do not care what other people get up to in the bedroom. You know, and in fact, the church itself has said people should be able to choose their own private acts of morality. These things should not be criminalised, and therefore we aren't. It is. I think there's a lot of projection going on here. We're not saying, oh, these horrible gay people, how vile, how disgusting what they get up to. That's not the point, you know. And nobody, well, certainly nobody I know has that attitude. This is for us to do with society and the common good and a wider principle, and it's not a question of trying to deprive anybody of any civil rights that they should have.
Well, you say that's not a question, but that is in effect what you are doing when you campaign against equality for gay people.
But do you think marriage is a civil right? Do you think?
Yes,
do you think
I think civil marriage is a civil right.
But why do you want the state to recognise your private romantic relationship?
The same reason that everybody else does. There are obviously practical implications to do with, you know, succession and property rights, hospital visiting rights, all of those things. But language is also important, as we know from this discussion over the word homophobia. And I believe that the state should recognise my relation the same as everybody else.
Hugely frustrating, but Rory, Caroline and Brandon, thank you so much for joining us on World Have Your Say. We'll carry on talking about this on the BBC World Service in a couple of hours' time.